In his bewitching novel, The Child in Time, Ian McEwan gives us a desolate character and narrator who is reduced by tragedy to a near-inert state, in which he vacantly watches a great deal of daytime TV. Observing the way in which his fellow creatures allow themselves, volunteer themselves, to be manipulated and humiliated, he coins the phrase for those who indulge themselves in witnessing the spectacle. It is, he decides, the Democrats' pornography. It is not snobbish to notice the way in which people show their gullibility and their herd instinct and their wish, or perhaps their need, to be credulous and to be fooled. This is an ancient problem. Credulity may be a form of innocence and even innocuous in itself, but it provides a standing invitation for the wicked and the clever to exploit their brothers and sisters, and is thus one of humanity's great vulnerabilities. No honest account of the growth and persistence of religion, or the reception of miracles and revelations, is possible without reference to this stubborn fact. If the followers of the Prophet Muhammad hoped to put an end to any future revelations after the immaculate conception of the Quran, they reckoned without the founder of what is now one of the world's fastest-growing faiths, and they did not foresee, how could they, mammals as they were, that the prophet of this ridiculous cult would model himself on theirs. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, hereafter known as the Mormons, was founded by a gifted opportunist who, despite couching his text in openly plagiarized Christian terms, announced that "I shall be to this generation a new Muhammad," and adopted as his fighting slogan the words which he thought he'd learned from Islam, either the Al-Quran or the sword. He was too ignorant to know that if you use the word al, you do not need another definite article, but then he did resemble Muhammad in being able only to make a borrowing out of other people's Bibles. In March 1826, a court in Bainbridge, New York, convicted a 21-year-old man of being a disorderly person and an impostor. That ought to have been all we ever heard of Joseph Smith, who at trial admitted to defrauding citizens by organizing mad gold-digging expeditions and also to claiming to possess dark or necromantic powers. However, within 4 years he was back in the local newspapers, all of which one may still read, as the discoverer of the Book of Mormon. He had two huge local advantages which most mountebanks and charlatans do not possess. First, he was operating in the same hectically pious district that gave us the Shakers, the previously mentioned George Miller, who repeatedly predicted the end of the world, and several other self-proclaimed American prophets. So notorious did this local tendency become that the region became known as the Burned-Over District, in honor of the way in which it had surrendered to one religious craze after another. Second, he was operating in an area which, unlike large tracts of the newly opening North America, did possess the signs of an ancient history. A vanished and vanquished Indian civilization had bequeathed a considerable number of burial mounds, which, when randomly and amateurishly desecrated, were found to contain not merely bones, but also quite advanced artifacts of stone, copper, and beaten silver. There were 8 of these sites, within 12 miles of the underperforming farm, which the Smith family called home. There were 2 equally stupid schools or factions who took a fascinated interest in such matters. The first were the gold diggers and treasure diviners, who brought their magic sticks and crystals and stuffed toads to bear in the search for lucre, and the second, those who hoped to find the resting place of a lost tribe of Israel. Smith's cleverness was to be a member of both groups, and to unite cupidity with half-baked anthropology. The actual story of the imposture is almost embarrassing to read and almost embarrassingly easy to uncover. It has been best told by Dr. Fawn Brodie, whose 1945 book No Man Knows My History was a good-faith attempt by a professional historian to put the kindest possible interpretation on the relevant events. In brief, Joseph Smith announced that he had been visited 3 times, as is customary, by an angel named Moroni. The said angel informed him of a book written upon gold plates, which explained the origins of those living on the North American continent, as well as the truths of the gospel. There were, further, 2 magic stones set in the twin breastplates Urim and Thummim of the Old Testament that would enable Smith himself to translate the aforesaid book. After many wrestlings, he brought this buried apparatus home with him on September 21st, 1827, about 18 months after his conviction for fraud. He then set about producing a translation. The resulting books turned out to be a record, set down by ancient prophets, beginning with Nephi, son of Lehi, who had fled Jerusalem in approximately 600 BC and come to America. Many battles, curses, and afflictions accompanied their subsequent wanderings, and those of their numerous progeny. How did the books turn out to be this way? Smith refused to show the golden plates to anybody, claiming that for other eyes to view them would mean death. But he encountered a problem that will be familiar to students of Islam. He was extremely glib and fluent as a debater and story weaver, as many accounts attest. But he was illiterate, at least in the sense that while he could read a little, he could not write. A scribe was therefore necessary to take his inspired dictation. This scribe was at first his wife Emma, and then, when more hands were necessary, a luckless neighbour named Martin Harris. Hearing Smith cite the words of Isaiah 29, verses 11 to 12, concerning the repeated injunction to read, Harris mortgaged his farm to help in the task and moved in with the Smiths. He sat on one side of a blanket hung across the kitchen, and Smith sat on the other with his translation stones, intoning through the blanket. As if to make this an even happier scene, Harris was warned that if he tried to glimpse the plates or look at the prophet, he'd be struck dead. Mrs. Harris was having none of this, and was already furious with the fecklessness of her husband. She stole the first 116 pages, and challenged Smith to reproduce them, as presumably, given his power of revelation, he could. Determined women like this appear far too seldom in the history of religion. After a very bad few weeks, the ingenious Smith countered with another revelation. He could not replicate the original, which might be in the devil's hands by now and open to a satanic verse's interpretation. But the all-foreseeing Lord had meanwhile furnished some smaller plates, indeed the very plates of Nephi, which told a fairly similar tale. With infinite labour the translation was resumed, with new scriveners behind the blanket as occasion demanded, and when it was completed, all the original golden plates were transported to heaven, where apparently they remain to this day. Mormon partisans sometimes say, as do Muslims, that this cannot have been fraudulent because the work of deception would have been too much for one poor and illiterate man. They have on their side two useful points. If Muhammad was ever convicted in public of fraud and attempted necromancy, we have no record of the fact, and Arabic is a language that is somewhat opaque even to the fairly fluent outsider. However, we know the Quran to be made up in part of earlier books and stories, and in the case of Smith it is likewise a simple if tedious task to discover that 25,000 words of the Book of Mormon are taken directly from the Old Testament. These words can mainly be found in the chapters of Isaiah available in Ethan Smith's View of the Hebrews, the 10 Tribes of Israel in America. This then popular work by a pious loony, claiming that the American Indians originated in the Middle East, seems to have started the other Smith on his gold-digging in the first place. A further 2,000 words of the Book of Mormon are taken from the New Testament. Of the 350 names in the book, more than 100 come straight from the Bible, and 100 more are as near stolen as makes no difference. The great Mark Twain famously referred to it as chloroform in print, but I accuse him of hitting too soft a target, since the book does actually contain the Book of Ether. The words "and it came to pass" can be found at least 2,000 times, which does admittedly have a soporific effect. Quite recent scholarship has exposed every single other Mormon document as at best a scrawny compromise and at worst a pitiful fake, as Dr. Brodie was obliged to notice when she reissued and updated her remarkable book in 1973. Like Muhammad, Smith could produce divine revelations at short notice and often simply to suit himself, especially, and like Muhammad, when he wanted a new girl and wished to take her as another wife. As a result, he overreached himself and came to a violent end, having meanwhile excommunicated almost all the poor men who had been his first disciples, and who had been browbeaten into taking his dictation. Still, this story raises some very absorbing questions concerning what happens when a plain racket turns into a serious religion before our eyes.